No, I try to understand. It makes no difference what you do, they always find you. Watch as they fall to your feet. Oh, if you only knew all the little things that they do for you. You know you drive them crazy, baby, but you never care. You look in their face like they weren't there. As I recall, I'd never fall for you. But it's a strange situation that I'm going through. I feel so high every time I take a look at you. Get out of my brain, because you drive me insane. It's a strange situation that you'll find me in. I begin watching you, calling you, hanging up, I'll dial again. Oh, won't you tell me what to do? Because I'm so in need of you. Oh, what a fallen star. I really like the way that you drive your car. You know it drives me crazy, baby, when you drive so fast. As I recall, I never fall for you. Look what you made me do. But it's a strange situation that I'm going through. I feel so high every time I take a look at you. Get out of my brain, because you drive me insane. Oh, won't you watch me as I bleed, because I'm in so desperate need. Oh, what a fallen star. I really like the way that you drive your car. You know it drives me crazy, baby, when you drive so fast. As I recall, I never fall for you. Look what you made me do for you. It makes no difference what you do, they always want you. Watch as they fall to your feet. Take what you wanna take. They'll even let you break what you wanna break. You know it drives them crazy, baby, but they're not upset. Do what you want, they'll just forget. As I recall, I'd never fall for you. But it's a strange situation that I'm going through. I feel so high every time I take a look at you. Get out of my brain, because you drive me insane. It's a strange situation that you'll find me in. I begin watching you, calling you, hanging up, I'll dial again. Oh, won't you tell me what to do? Because I'm so in need of you. Oh, what a fallen star. I really like the way that you drive your car. You know it drives me crazy, baby, when you drive so fast. As I recall, I never fall for you. Look what you made me do. Oh, what a fallen star. I really like the way that you drive your car. You know it drives me crazy, baby, when you drive so fast. As I recall, I never fall for you. Look what you made me do. As I recall, I never fall for you. For you. As I recall, I'd never fall for you. For you. For you.
Giving me the hold up. You know I wish you'd make your mind up. Cause when we get it on, it's so. You used to be my Romeo. Cause you see, my dear, I have had enough of keeping quiet about all this stuff. You're neurotic like a yo-yo. You used to be my Romeo. Giving me the hold up. You know I wish you'd make your mind up. Cause when we get it on, it's so. You used to be my Romeo. Cause you see, my dear, I have had enough of keeping quiet about all this stuff. You're neurotic like a yo-yo. Oh, you used to be my I can't stop yawning. Cause the tears on the pillow dry, my dear. Gonna let it all go, gonna have no fear. Yeah. You used to be my Romeo. Go, yeah. Let it all go. My Romeo, my Romeo, my Romeo. My Romeo, my Romeo, my Romeo.
Hello, my love, I heard a kiss from you. Red magic Saturn playing Neil too. All through the morning rain I gaze, the sun doesn't shine. Rainbows and waterfalls run through my mind. In the garden I see west purple shower bells and tea, orange bells and river cousins dressed in green. Pretty music I hear, so happy and loud. Blue flower echo from my cherry cloud.
Chairman of the Capital Markets Board of Turkey, Mr. Vahdettin Ertaş, distinguished representatives of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, esteemed CMB board members, managers within the public and the private sector, members of the press, and distinguished speakers and guests. I am delighted to welcome you to the Capital Markets Board of Turkey, an organization for economic cooperation and development, for the conference on G20 OECD Corporate Governance Forum here in Istanbul. Unfortunately, though, we have a change in the program. We have received a recent message from His Excellency Ali Babacan stating that due to an unexpected last-minute meeting, he won't be able to join us, unfortunately, and offers his sincere apologies and wishes that the conference may be successful and fruitful for everyone. Moreover, due to the recent wide cancellations of flights in France, the esteemed Secretary General of the OECD, Mr. Angel Gurria, will not be joining us either. He also has asked us to convey to you his sincere apologies. Let me briefly outline to you the structure of our conference. Our forum shall comprise of 3 separate panels. The first panel will be on the idea of having finance serve the real economy towards the new OECD principles of corporate governance. The second panel shall be on corporate governance and value creation, institutionalization of growth companies and SMEs. And finally, the third panel shall be on corporations and capital markets in emerging economies. Each session shall last for 1.5 hours, and the questions and answers sessions shall follow after every speaker in a panel has delivered his speech. So, without further ado, dear guests, I hereby invite Mr. Vahdettin Ertaş, Chairman of the CMB, to stage to deliver his opening remarks, sir.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, member of press. I welcome you all in Istanbul on the occasion of the Corporate Governance Forum jointly hosted by the OECD and the Capital Market Board of Turkey under the G20 Turkish presidency. I would like to thank the Boğaziçi University and the Corporate Governance Association of Turkey for helping us to organize this important event. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, more than 7 years after the financial crisis began, overcoming the legacies of the crisis remains high on the agenda of the global economy. The challenge is to support economic growth and job creation while reducing heavy national debt burden. Central banks have played a very critical role in this period, and thanks to the U.S. Fed policies. As you know, U.S. economy has experienced a successful economic recovery. However, there hasn't been a strong economic recovery and job creation globally. Despite all measures taken, economic growth and inflation in the developed economies, notably in the EU, are still not at desired levels. Many countries couldn't come out of the recession in spite of their negative interest rate policies. Particularly, the unemployment rate have reached 20–30% level in some countries. In addition, increase in debt stocks has accelerated in the aftermath of a financial crisis. The global debt stock has increased 50–70 trillion US dollars since 2008. Most particularly, sovereign debt stocks have been increasing at an alarming rate. The expectation for an interest rate rise by Fed have recently created turbulence in the global markets. Therefore, we believe that Fed will consider not only the U.S. market, but also the possible implication of their interest rate policy in other economies before taking further steps. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that we need substantial increase in investment in order to reestablish long-term economic growth. When we consider the high level of sovereign debt burdens, the need for private sector investment is becoming much more prominent. Turkey had a different experience from many other countries over the last 12 years. Public debt stock has been reduced to 35% from 77%. Being one of the least affected countries from the global financial crisis, Turkey maintained an average annual growth rate of 5% in the same period. We strongly advocate that creating an appropriate environment encouraging the private sector investment is crucial for making high growth sustainable in Turkey. And to make this happen, we have recently made major changes in tax law to strengthen the equity structures of our companies and encourage corporation use of equity finance through public offering. To reduce the tax advantage of debt financing or equity financing, we provide corporations with the opportunity to deduct from their earning 50% of their cost of debt applied to the new equity capital raised. In the case of public offering, this rate could be increased up to 150%. For example, while a company can deduct 5 Turkish liras for a 100 Turkish liras equity capital increase, the same company, if it is publicly listed or going to the publicly listed, can deduct 15 Turkish liras for the same amount of equity financing. This new regulation will both strengthen the capital structure of our companies by reducing their debt to equity ratio and support their access to finance through capital markets. Ladies and gentlemen, adoption and implementation of good corporate governance standards is of vital importance. This is because, firstly, to avoid any financial crisis, and secondly, to ensure investor confidence in the capital markets. We all know that the weaknesses in corporate governance practices had played a significant role in the emergence of 2008 financial crisis. We encountered many cases where the corporation, particularly from the financial sector, were not able to successfully and sufficiently measure their risk and act in a transparent way to their shareholders. For instance, today, as a result of that discussion, only 20% of investors in the United States reported to have confidence in financial markets. One of the conditions of well-functioning capital market is the trust of investors in both the financial system and the companies they invest in. The new OECD principles of corporate governance, for which gathered to discuss today, describe this fact quite simply. If one country desires to attract long-term capital from international markets, it should establish a predictable and credible corporate governance system compatible with international standards. This is also key of importance for reducing the cost of equity for companies and their access to sustainable finance. Regarding the SMEs, as a result of their limited institutional capacities, we know that smaller companies have only access to short-term and more expensive financing from credit markets. SMEs account for almost 30% of jobs and have been backbone of export sector in most countries, including Turkey. With the growth potential they have, their contribution to innovation and job creation is of crucial significance. In order to attract investors from capital markets, those companies should also be equipped with a well-functioning corporate governance mechanism. The demand of investors on companies are quite rational. Be transparent and accountable. Establish necessary framework for effective corporate governance. This is much more important for emerging market companies. In order to reduce their dependence on short-term bank loans and attract the attention of global institutional investors, they have to adopt and implement internationally accepted corporate governance practices. As the Capital Market Board of Turkey, we are committed to fulfill our own responsibilities by introducing mandatory corporate governance principles with our new capital market law in recent years. We have strengthened our corporate governance framework. The new framework includes many provisions with respect to related party transactions, enhancing the effectiveness of companies' boards and shareholders' participation in the decision-making process of companies. There has been significant progress, but globally, we still have a long way to go. We believe that the new OECD principle will provide us with important and helpful guidance. Let me conclude by wishing for the success of this meeting and expressing my sincere thanks to the OECD, all those involved in the participation of the forum, and all our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now I would like to hereby invite Matt Isaacson on stage to speak on behalf of the General Secretary of the OECD in delivering his opening remarks, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Again, on behalf of the Secretary General, he's great excuses for not being able to be here. I talked to him after midnight last night when he was still at the airport in Paris, trying every means in the world to get a flight to come and be with us today. He had then spent the better half of the evening at the airport, and you know what that is like. So there is no doubt about his commitment and his ambition to be here with you today, but unfortunately, due to the air control strike, he could not make it. So he asked me to deliver his address to you and wish this meeting a very fruitful discussions. This G20 OECD Corporate Governance Forum is a response to a request from the G20 finance ministers and governors of central bank leaders meeting, who in Istanbul in February asked us to present the new and revised OECD principles to the finance ministers meeting in September for later transmission to the Antalya G20 Leaders Summit. We are currently reviewing and updating the OECD principles, and all G20 countries are invited to participate in this process on an equal footing. This makes the review of the principles yet another example where the OECD works closely with the G20, with its presidency, and with its membership. The joint review and update of our corporate governance principles aims at contributing to a stronger backbone for trade and investment, which is crucial at a time when the global economy continues to expand at only a moderate pace, particularly in Europe. One cylinder of the global growth engine, in particular, is still firing only at half speed. And this is investment. In spite of very low interest rates and an ultra-low monetary policy, global investment has remained weak in the OECD. The volume of fixed investments is still well below the pre-crisis level. This is especially the case in Europe and in Japan, where the volume of investment is 16.6% and 8.6% below the early 2008 levels, respectively. This is why investment, and rightfully, is an important priority during the G20 presidency of Turkey. Increasing investment will require structural reforms, not least in the area of corporate governance. In this effect, we are obviously dedicated to support the Turkish G20 presidency, and I would like to compliment Mr. Babacan and the Turkish government for their excellent leadership. The review of the corporate governance principles will make an important contribution to the investment agenda of G20, and it will, in particular, support the so-called 3 I's of the Turkish presidency. That is investment, it is inclusiveness, and not least, it is about implementation. First, as I said, these principles will help to create the conditions for unlocking real productive investment by corporations, and thus it will contribute to the G20 objective set by leaders in Brisbane of raising growth by 2% over the baseline by 2018. Resuming investment is partly a question of access to finance, but it's also a matter of using the money that you already have. Some companies are cut off from finance, while others are awash with cash. In the wake of the financial crisis, bank lending to non-financial corporations has been in retreat in many countries, especially where growth has been weak. In Europe, it dropped by almost 15%. The OECD's 2015 SME Finance Scoreboard, which the Secretary General will launch at the G20 meeting in Washington next week, will show that this is particularly bothersome for small and medium-sized enterprises. Access to investors via a well-functioning capital market is crucial for small and medium-sized companies, particularly for those who have an ambition to innovate and to take risks in terms of forward-looking research and development. These companies need an alternative to short-term loans that often requires strict collaterals and is a constant need of refinancing. They need, in one word, long-term capital in the form of equity. This is why the new principles contain a chapter about the role of institutional investors, the incentives of financial intermediaries, and the functioning of our stock markets. For example, with respect to disclosure of fee structures in the investment chain, the need to manage conflicts of interests, and equal access to market information. But as I said, while some companies are cut off, it is also a matter of using the money that you already have. And many large non-financial companies sit today on huge piles of cash. This trend emerged since 2000, but has accelerated in recent years. One of the problems here is that some remuneration systems create incentives for executives and asset managers to push up share prices via buybacks, which add little value to the economy over the longer term. There is therefore an urgent need to revisit executive remuneration so that it can be better aligned with long-term investment objectives, and the new principles call for a greater role of shareholders in setting remuneration of their board members and their key executives. With the new revised principles, we also aim at contributing to more inclusiveness, taking our citizens on board. Between 1990 and 2007, it is estimated that the revenues of securities market intermediaries increased from 1% to 5% of gross national product. And with a longer and more complex investment industry, we must remember that most of the money that is handled ultimately belongs to private households, to hardworking people. It is estimated that Europeans between the ages of 35 and 65 years old now allocate more than 1/3 of their savings to the stock market. This is partly the result of political decisions to encourage funded pension systems. And these reforms may indeed have their merits, but they must come with a political responsibility to provide these households with fair and transparent financial markets and the tools with which to navigate them. We must also remember that each additional link in the investment chain between households and savings and the real corporate investments come at a cost. The new principles also address this issue, as they require corporate governance rules that provide sound incentives throughout the investment chain. Last but not least, the principles are not an empty declaration. It is a living document that is put into practical use every day at the international level. In this work, OECD has always partnered with other international organizations and within individual countries beyond the OECD membership. Already since the very beginning, the OECD principles have been a part of the Financial Stability Board's core standards. And as such, the World Bank has carried out more than 40 country reviews, more than 50 different country reviews, where they have used the OECD principles as the benchmark. More than 40 countries have participated in the OECD's corporate governance roundtables around the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America, and in Russia, and in North Africa. There they have established a list of concrete reform priorities that we are now monitoring the implementation of. The People's Republic of China, a couple of years ago, carried out a very ambitious and highly qualified assessment of their corporate governance system using the OECD principles. And next week, I am going to Japan, and I'm going too. So this is both me and the Secretary General. We are both going to Japan, where they are about to issue their new corporate governance code, which is actually based on the OECD principles of corporate governance. And we congratulate the Japanese authorities for their hard work in that effort. The list can be made much longer, but I will stop here, but also underline that implementation is key, and that all of you that are here today in this room play a crucial role in that effort. Last, I want to return to the valuable contributions that we have received from emerging market economies throughout the years and throughout the review. While there are obvious variations among these countries, a common feature for many companies in emerging markets is that they have a lot of loans as compared to equity. This may not only create a financial uncertainty and a constant pressure to repay or to refinance, it may actually influence the very path of industrial development. It may hamper the ability of businesses to innovate, to expand into areas that are more human capital intensive or require more risk-taking. This is why we have a special session today on emerging markets, chaired by the CEO of the National Exchange of India, Madam Ramkrishna. And we have a special address by Mr. Yao, who is the Executive Vice Chairman of the Chinese Association for Public Companies. The quality of corporate governance is an important factor for taking a country's business sector up and forward along the value chain. The revisions of the principles can be a critical contribution to the agenda objectives of the G20, be it in the area of investments specifically or with respect to the 2% growth ambition more broadly. So let me conclude by inviting and encouraging all G20 members to take an active role in the discussion about the review and to promote the use of the principles. We are all here for the same goal: better corporate governance, for stronger growth, trade and investment, and for more dynamic companies that will contribute to better lives. Last, I want to again extend my warm thanks to the Capital Markets Board of Turkey, to our host, the Turkish Corporate Governance Associations, and to the Bogazici University. I wish you a fruitful day of discussions and regret I couldn't be with you due to circumstances beyond my control. Thank you very much.
We thank you, Mr. Isaacson. Now I would like to hereby invite Marcello Bianchi, Chairman of the OECD Corporate Governance Committee, on stage to deliver his keynote address.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to start with the question. Why does the OECD care about corporate governance, and why is it an issue for the G20s now? The OECD Secretary General, through Mats and our host, Mr. Hertash, provided already good reason to understand in the current macro and microeconomic framework the relevance of corporate governance in the toolbox of policymakers. Let me put those reasons in the context of the revision of the OECD principles. The revision represents the ambitious goal of the OECD Committee to respond to the current challenges raised by the financial crisis, but also by the structural changes which are affecting the market landscape. But this task has been assumed not only by the OECD Committee and its traditional constituencies, the member countries and its partners of the civil society, BIAC and TUAC, which represent respectively business and trade unions. The revision of the principles has been actually carried out by a larger assembly where all the G20 countries have been associated on equal basis to share the goal and the responsibility to develop an instrument for policy making which is suited to the global dimension of the current economy. And what we are presenting in this meeting is the outcome of an hard work of research, analysis, dialogue, and elaboration developed not only in the Paris meeting rooms of the OECD, but mainly in the largest arena of the many initiatives developed with our partners all around the world. I am referring to the corporate governance regional roundtables established by the OECD in Asia, Latin America, Middle East and North Africa, Eurasia and Southern Africa, and to the bilateral program developed with individual emerging economies like China, Russia, India and Indonesia. In this global context, the principles of corporate governance have proved to be a standard for policy making. In this global context, their recommendations have been tested with respect to the specific characteristics of the different models of ownership and of financial intermediation. In this global context, we have experienced also the limits of some of the traditional assumptions in the corporate governance dominant culture. But more importantly, in this global context, we have found the sources and the input for the revision of the principles. But let me take a step backward and go to the very nature of the principles, to their history, their status, and to their main contents. The OECD Principles of Corporate Governance is a public policy instrument intended to assist governments in their efforts to evaluate and improve the legal, regulatory, and institutional framework for corporate governance. As explicitly formulated in the mandate that was given to the OECD Corporate Governance Committee in 2010, but implicitly incorporated in the initial commitment of the OECD work in this area, the objective is to contribute to economic efficiency, sustainable growth, and financial stability. In practice, this objective is achieved by formulating principles for policies that give market participants sound economic incentives to perform their respective roles within a framework of check and balances where transparency, supervision, and effective enforcement provides confidence in market practices and institutions. As such, the principles has become the global standard for policy making in corporate governance, adopted by the main international organizations, such as the Financial Stability Board and the World Bank, and used as a reference by both OECD member and non-member countries. The history of the principles reflects their public policy nature and their orientation towards sustainable economic growth and financial stability goals. They were established in 1997 in the aftermath of the Southeast financial crisis, where corporate governance failures were identified as one of the main structural weaknesses of an area which was considered strategic for the economic growth at economic level. The principles have been then revised in 2004 after the wave of corporate scandals occurred in several mature economies and after the collapse of the internet bubble in the main stock markets. Both those phenomena showed the potential systemic disruptive power of distorted incentives of management and of weak or collusive supervision by the internal and external corporate gatekeepers. Again, corporate governance failures, this time in well-developed economies and with sophisticated corporate governance arrangements. Similar problems, but mainly concentrated in the larger financial institution, emerged in the recent financial crisis. The corporate governance rules and practices, even those pretending to be best practices, prove to be ineffective to face the new and often unexpected challenges raised by the turbulent developments of the international financial markets. Also, the new rules established in the previous decade as a reaction, maybe overreaction, to the so-called Enron and Parmalat era, failed, at least in their implementation, if not in their substance. The consequences on the real economy of those failures, once again with misaligned managerial incentives and ineffective or distorted internal and external control, are too recent and painful to be described. This time, while promptly recognizing the corporate governance involvement in the crisis, the OECD committee has adopted a patient approach, giving prominence to the analysis of what we call the corporate governance lesson from the financial crisis. The conclusion of that analysis was that while certain rules and regulation can be improved, this is not the main problem. Much more important is to establish a review process that identifies issues and new developments that may cause problems down the line. To look around the corner, to detect new trends, to raise awareness, and to help share information about how potential problems can be avoided. Along these lines, the committee approved a report identifying a set of recommendations and emerging good practices in the areas more affected by the financial crisis for a better implementation of the OECD principles. The committee also decided to develop better mechanisms for peer review and peer dialogue. Before the revision process, we finalized peer reviews on 6 key areas, which according to our analysis can play a crucial role in the changing corporate governance landscape: board practices and election, the role of institutional investors, related party transaction, risk governance, and public and private enforcement. 19 countries have been involved in the in-depth analysis of those peer review, including key non-member countries such as India, Brazil, Singapore, and Indonesia. Only at the end of this process we decided to engage ourselves in the review of the principles through an inclusive and informed process. As I said at the beginning, we invited all the G20 countries to take part to this work. Most of them are now in the committee, and they have played a crucial role all along the process. And this conference testifies the structural and strategic linkage that has been created between OECD and the G20s in the field of corporate governance. The review was informed through an ongoing consultation process with all the relevant stakeholders: the business sector, investor, professional groups at national and international levels, trade unions, civil society organizations, and other international standard-setting bodies. Let me mention in particular the contribution provided in this process by the 2 OECD strategic partners in the civil society, BIAC and TUAC. They met on a regular basis with the committee to discuss the various drafts of the review and submitted proposals for the review. The lively dialogue with them is a crucial asset of the committee. In order to provide input to the review process, the committee has also launched the project on corporate governance, value creation, and growth. The initiative started in 2013 with the conference here in Istanbul and addresses how better corporate governance policies can support corporate access to capital, value creation, and economic growth. Let me thank the Turkish government, and in particular the Turkish Capital Market Board, for their support of this project, which represented one of the main pillars of the review process. Before the launch of that project, the link between corporate governance on one side and value creation and growth on the other side was not so well understood and studied. Now, policymakers are paying a growing attention to this dimension of corporate governance as an instrument to support innovation and growth policies both in mature and emerging economies. It can be meaningful to mention that the Italian presidency of the European Union adopted the title Corporate Governance, Value Creation and Growth of the OECD project as the main message of its policy in the area of corporate governance and company law. This approach, more oriented to long-term perspective and to an holistic view of institutional and market elements, strongly affected the contents of the draft revised principles we present today. On this draft, after 1 year of an intense dialogue, both internal and external, there is now a strong agreement by the whole committee, including the associated countries. My feeling as chairman of the committee is that all the actors involved in the revision, the countries in the committee, but also the so-called clients of the principles who participated to the different form of consultation, share the common goal and actively cooperated to identify areas for improvement and, when necessary, pragmatic and not compromise solution to different views. This is important to maintain high the quality of the principles. And the quality of the principles is not given by their accordance to the academic standards of good corporate governance, but rather from the economic outcomes of the policies they inspire and support. This is the experience we had with the implementation of the principles in countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, where the principles have been used to support development policy, like the launch of a stock market segment for growth company in Brazil, or to address specific relevant problems of corporate governance, like related party transaction or transparency of beneficial owners. We will listen to the real players who can testify the relevance of those experiences in terms of outcomes and not only in terms of compliance with the so-called international standards. In line with the outcome orientation of the principles, corporate governance cannot be considered only a static set of rules and practice, even when they are defined best practices, but mainly as a dynamic and living network of relationships among the different actors and stakeholders of corporation, including shareholders, board managers, executives, as well as financial intermediaries and services providers. And in line with this view, the principles have to be challenging, not only a picture of the state of the art of rules and culture of corporate governance, they have to be flexible for different implementation, taking into consideration the different model of corporate governance, the different patterns of ownership and control model, the different legal and markets features at national level. But the principle overall must be relevant for policymakers. They should offer policy tools for perceiving policy objective, and they have to remain relevant in a rapidly changing environment. And in the area of corporate governance, we have seen some important changes that may impact the efficiency of current policies and may call for new approaches. Notably, we see changes in stock market and ownership. There are profound changes in the structure of stock markets, with fragmented trading places in competition to provide services and infrastructure. Today, trade practices are also more complex, and new equity-based instruments increase in importance. Also, ownership of shares in listed companies moved from a direct ownership to intermediary. The universe of investors has become more complex, with a wide range of different types of institutional investors. The way from savers to companies has become longer. Taken together, these changes have changed the conditions for corporate governance in profound ways, and the OECD is at the cutting edge of understanding the implication and responding to how regulation can remain relevant and effective in this new environment. For all this reason, the review of the principle is an ambitious task, and it requires a new approach to take into consideration the structural changes I mentioned before and to address the economic challenges they raise for policymakers. As for the content of the review, we focus on the issues which can play a strategic role in policymaking after the financial crisis, not only to overcome the failures we have seen, mainly in the implementation of principles and rules, let me mention the enforcement I mentioned, for example, but also and mainly to facilitate the access of corporations to the equity market on one side, to encourage and support the confidence of savers on the equity market on the other, because we think that the equity market continues to be crucial for the economic growth. In this perspective, special attention has been devoted to the companies which are controlled by a single shareholder or by a group of shareholders. But also other issues have been considered: risk management, remuneration, shareholder engagement. A new chapter has been introduced to consider the importance of capital markets structure and of financial intermediation of corporate governance. The chapter on institutional investors, stock market data and intermediaries, where we address the role and responsibility of institutional investors, the role of corporate governance providers like the proxy advisor, the importance of the efficiency and transparency of price discovery mechanism and process in the stock market. To conclude, as I said, the review of the principle is an ambitious task, but policy making is ambitious, and this is true overall in the current hard times. But we are trying also to be wise and to avoid the hubris to have simple solution to complex problem. Corporate governance is a complicated issue, and as policymakers we have to be aware of complexity. For this reason, it is important to consider the principles not only as a standard, but also and mainly as a basis for an ongoing dialogue among policymakers and between policymakers and the principal users. This is the spirit of this conference, and this will be the spirit of the following activities on the OECD in the next months and in the next years, where we will present the new principles all around the world. Not to export the OECD wisdom, but rather to challenge our views and to find further inputs and ideas to go ahead. Thank you.
We thank you, Mr. Bianchi. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have a coffee break for 30 minutes, please.